Craig Whitney is with us. He is the founder of Multiply Project. And I have known Craig for the past almost 6 to 7 years. My wife and I set out to plant a church in the greater Houston area. And we went through the process with Stadia Church Planting Network. And Craig was a coach on the Stadia team there at that time. And he was very instrumental in helping us plant a gospel-centered multiplying church in the greater Houston area. I still remember the time where my wife and I were in the process of deciding on how to best get postcards out into the community that we were planting. And we were thinking about different ideas of how to best get the name of the church out there and how to put that out there in front of people as we were building relationships with the community. And Craig was like, hey, you have a beautiful family. You guys are photogenic. You guys have all great smiles, and I mean, you're planting in a multi-ethnic community. We're a interracial family. And so he's like, you just got to put the picture of your family on a postcard, put the name of the church on it, and just send it out there. Because you guys, I mean, we're just made for it. And we did just that, and grateful for that advice. And we ended up just, marketing the whole area with a picture of our family, with the name of the church and the grand opening date and everything. And God truly just blessed tremendously. So Craig has always helped church planters think outside the box, very innovative and creative. And I always valued Craig's leadership and his wisdom when it comes to multiplication. Also, fundraising genius. With church planting and starting new churches, part of the process is developing a multiplication fundraising initiatives. And so he was very helpful with that, and so grateful for him. He has helped many church planters in the United States, and grateful that my friend Craig Whitney is here to help us in this 3-day workshop. So we are launching this today. This is day one, and we have 2 other workshops that are lined up for also September and October. We have those dates listed on our mailing list and also our website as well. And thank you for those that have registered, because it's going to be a great journey. You're going to be receiving tools that will help you, because our mission here at Texas Ministries is to equip churches, pastors, and leaders to make disciples who make disciples. And that's the mandate. That's the mission that Jesus gave us, to go and make disciples of all nations. And so for us, that's our mandate. And here, we're excited to get started here. So Craig, the floor is yours, my friend.
Awesome. Thank you. I am really grateful to be here. Grateful for you, friend, and just been fun to partner with you on your church planting journey, and now in your role with Texas Ministries. I just really appreciate your leadership and your commitment to multiplication. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. I want to thank all of you that are here as well. I'm always really mindful that there are a lot of other things you could be doing with this hour. You're like me, you've got whole lists of things to get done in a day and a week, and you've chosen to spend the hour here. And so I'm very grateful for that and appreciate the opportunity to share with you today. I'm going to share my screen here really quick. I want to get a couple things out there that you guys that pop up there. So first thing is, I want to just make sure right up front that everybody knows you can use that QR code, or you can follow that link, write that link down there, link multipliproject.org /TXM. I'm going to share some tools later on. Those will be in that folder. The slides, everything I'm going to share is going to be in that folder. I know a lot of times people are like, I got to get all this information, capture the screen. And I just want to make sure everything will be there for you to download. Take notes, please, but take notes on the things that are really mindful to you versus trying to capture something that I've been sharing, because we'll make sure that you get all of those things. I also want to make sure that everybody knows how to use the chat in Zoom. So find that there's a chat button somewhere and open that little chat box. And thanks for putting the link right there. It's in the chat already. Here's a question I want you to we're just going to start off with, and you can answer in the chat. What would you see or hear someone What would you see or hear about that would make you think this is a multiplying church? So imagine maybe it's your own church. Maybe you're visiting someone else's churches. Maybe you're just talking to someone about their church. What would you see or hear that when you would hear it, you would think or see it, you go, oh man, that must be a multiplying church. Just what comes to mind that would be evidence or indication to you of a multiplying church? Just type some ideas there into the chat. Somebody's got to be brave and go first. You guys know what it is? Church planting. The word's church planting. There you go. Tim knows how to like get me all fired up. I'm all about church planting. So what else? What would you see or hear? You guys don't even have keyboards in front of you. New faces, introducing visitors. I like that. Exemplary guest services, baptisms. Yes. Souls coming to the kingdom. New groups. I love that. New groups. Disciples making disciples. Cool. Intergenerational kids. I like that. I like that. All right. So we're going to talk today about, and these comments are great. Please feel free to keep those going as we go. Also, I want you guys to know that questions are awesome. So I've asked both Ivran and Chelsea's somewhere there in the background to watch the chat. I may be watching my notes or keep talking or whatever. If you've got a question, ask it. And we've got several places along the way. We'll stop and we'll look at those questions. I've even given them permission to interrupt me and say, hey, so-and-so's got a question about this. And so this is here for your benefit. Everything we're doing today is for your benefit. So I want to make sure that you know that you guys can just jump in, ask those questions in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer those. I also know that there's people on the call with sort of different roles in churches, right? I know that, I can see some groups of staff that are together. Some of you, couples lead churches together. If you're the pastor of a church, as you go through today, you're probably going to be thinking about the church, right? As a whole. And that's great. We're going to talk about that. Some of you have staff roles. And so as we go through today, you may be thinking more about the ministries that you lead, children, students, worship, whatever. That's great. And that will definitely apply as we go through today. I know there's a few of you in here that are not pastors or staff. You're leaders in your church, and I love that you're here today. I want you to be doing the same thing. Think about the ministries you lead, the people that you serve, the groups that you lead, as you think about how you can become part of a multiplying church, and you yourself can become a multiplier. That's really what we're going to talk about today. Start by just sharing a quote here. This is from Francis Chan, who says, Jesus did not command us to make disciples who would simply gather in ever larger groups. He commanded us to make disciples who would make disciples who would in turn make disciples. This is the essence of multiplication. Efren started out at the beginning, like that's the ministry, right? Make disciples who make disciples. That is the definition of a multiplying church. And that was Jesus' vision for his church. Jesus talks about this in the parable of the soils. Most of you are going to be familiar with this, but I want to go ahead and read it. Listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew and choked the plants so that they did not bear grain. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times. Now, if you've spent any time in church ministry and church leadership, you know the frustration of bad soil, right? Everyone has experienced that. People who just don't respond to the good news. You just talk about Jesus over and over and they just never respond. People who respond, but then as soon as things get a little difficult or something happens, they just kind of just disappear. Maybe people who seem to really be growing, really getting engaged in leadership, and you think, wow, this person's going to be an amazing leader in our church. And all of a sudden they just get caught up in something else, and their interests and their time and everything just kind of goes and focuses somewhere else. We've all experienced that bad soil in our work in churches. The question is, are we experiencing the kind of good soil Jesus described? He says it came up, right? That's just, people respond to the good news. They begin following Jesus. He says it grew. People grow in their faith. They grow in the fruit of the Spirit as they begin to be transformed by the work of Jesus and the work of Spirit in their lives. But then he gets to the end and he says this, multiplying 30, 60, even 100 times. Now, I've intentionally put wheat on this screen here that I'm sharing because that would have been one of the most common crops in Jesus' day, especially around the Sea of Galilee. And so as Jesus talked about the farmer in the sea, like it's very likely what people pictured. And it's fascinating that one of those little heads of grain, like I'm not a farmer at all, like I have to look this stuff up because I don't have any idea. But one of those little heads of grain on wheat typically contains about 50 seeds. Like that's the average, the median, the middle. And so when Jesus says, that a seed produced 30 times, that's actually less than average for a seed of the wheat. But then he says 60 and like, okay, that's about average. And then he says 100. That's like way above average. And I would imagine that Jesus' listeners, as he's talking about this 30, 60 times, are probably thinking about the grain. But can you imagine that one person who responds to the good news about Jesus produces 30, 60, or even 100 times more disciples? Now, in the context of the American church and our experience of the American church, for most of us, that just sounds absurd. How in the world is that even possible? We'd be happy to get one person to make one disciple, right? But somehow Jesus is intending something that we're not experiencing about the way that the good news and the gospel and people's lives are intended to multiply. Step forward a little bit into the book of Acts. Acts chapter 8 sits between the church in Jerusalem and all we learn about that church and Saul's conversion in chapter 9 and his mission of planting churches throughout the Roman world. And there's just this verse just kind of dropped in there. Those who have been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Stephen was stoned, the church was persecuted, people were scattered, but they preached the word wherever they went. They multiplied. They were disciples who made disciples. I have a maple tree just outside my window. So if you could imagine bedroom, my house, there's a window right here. I'm literally looking at that maple tree and all the shade that it provides. And that picture on the screen is one that I walked outside with my phone and took a picture of my lawn. Because this maple tree that's outside of my window was created by God to grow and multiply. And every year it drops seeds into my lawn. It scatters seeds, and those seeds sprout up and they turn into little miniature maple tree saplings in my lawn. And guess what? I don't want my maple tree to multiply. I love having one maple tree in my yard, but I don't want tens or hundreds or thousands of maple trees in my yard. I just want the one. So guess what? I have to go there and I have to pull up all of these little maple saplings so that I don't end up with a bunch of them. Why do I share with that? See, there's only one reason that the maple tree in front of me wouldn't scatter seed and produce more maple trees. It's because it was either sick or dying, because it was made to grow or multiply. So was Jesus' church. That is the way the church was designed. And I find sometimes that people fear multiplication. Oftentimes multiplication means sending. On a third workshop, we're going to talk about the transition from members to missionaries. And sending people to missionaries is kind of painful because it's the end of relations, or not the end, but it's a separation of relationship. Any of you have sent your kids off? I have a daughter who lives halfway around the world. Like that's challenging, and we fear that. We know that sometimes it costs to multiply. And so there's sort of these things that cause us to hesitate, but it's actually what Jesus designed. Just like the maple tree in my yard, Jesus' church was made to multiply. And there's just a simple scripture in Paul's instruction to Timothy that illustrates this so well. And it's where we always go when we talk about multiplication. When Paul tells Timothy, the things you've heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, right? So Timothy is a multiplication of Paul. Paul invested in Timothy. Timothy is now leading others. And he's saying, entrust to reliable people, what? Who will also be qualified to teach others. There's this picture of 4 generations: Paul, Timothy, reliable people who teach others, 4 generations of spiritual multiplication. And that's really a measure of a multiplying church, is are there spiritual generations? I love this quote from Tim Keller. He says, a multiplying church leaves a legacy of faith that goes beyond a single generation. It ensures that the gospel continues to spread and take root in new communities for years to come. See, your church has a vital role to play in your community right now, today. Absolutely, that is true. There are people there who need to meet Jesus today and who need to have their lives transformed. But those aren't the only people who need that, right? There will be people in your community who need that next year. and in the next decade, and every decade that follows until Jesus returns. And so this idea of spiritual generations and a legacy of faith that Keller talks about is so important. But there's a challenge in our context. Very few churches in the American context multiply. Most of you will be familiar with Exponential, I would imagine. You know, they put on the big conference, maybe you've been there, they produce all kinds of resources. And one of the things that they do is research. And back in 2019, they did some research around reproducing and multiplying churches, and they found that they could identify 7% of churches that they considered reproducing, but this is kind of scary, 0 that they considered multiplying. And the reason was none of them were second, third, or fourth generation, right? Reproducing meant a church that had planted a church, but they couldn't find evidence of churches that planted churches that planted churches, or disciples who made disciples who made disciples. Things weren't making it to that third and fourth generation. In 2020, they did research on disciple making, and they only found 5% of churches in the US have a reproducing disciple making culture. Again, that disciples who make disciples who make disciples. Now, I happened to be in a meeting with Dave Ferguson, who's the president of Exponential. He spoke at a lunch in my area a few weeks ago. And I was grateful to hear that they're updating this research. They're actually doing the research right now and we're releasing new information. And so we'll see whether these numbers have sort of increased or decreased kind of post-pandemic in America. And so I'll be grateful to take a look at that and see what's happening there. But it kind of begs the question, how did we get here? If Jesus intended his church to multiply, how did we end up with a church that doesn't multiply? I'm going to call attention to 2 things, and this is where I might step on some toes, but I think that these are 2 things that are really significant. The first thing that happened 80 to 150 years ago. And that is that the church in America outsourced leadership development. Now, if you have any kind of Bible college or seminary degree, you went to some kind of Bible college or seminary somewhere, meaning you got your training outside the context of the local church at that college. I'd be curious, and you could raise your hand, type these in the chat, just be curious, if you have a degree or you experienced education in that environment, how many of you went to a school that was formed? The school was founded and formed between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of World War II in the United States. That would mean it was founded somewhere between the 1870s and 1940. There is a Bible college in a Christian university in our backyard right here in Sacramento. It was founded in 1939. It fits right into that time frame. My dad was a professor at that college when I was born. And so there was a period of time where the church outsourced leadership development. George Fox fixed in that time frame. Yep. And so it's just interesting. If you study in the US, most of the colleges do. But then the second thing that happened was what we call the church growth movement that came into the American church in the 70s. And the church growth movement shifted the focus of the church onto what were things that were supposed to make it grow, like programs and facilities and marketing. All this happened around the time that I was coming into ministry. And I remember reading books about church growth that told me if we didn't have enough parking spaces that our church couldn't grow. I mean, that was kind of the focus, right, of church growth, was those kinds of things. And so the American church has been doing outsourced leadership development for over 100 years, has been doing church growth for over 50 years. And as a famous Texan would ask, how's that working for you? Now, I'll make a prediction, just because I know what most pastors experience. The first prediction I'll make is that you're tired. The second prediction that I'll make is that the people in your church are tired. Why? Because there is a lot of stuff that you are doing. And I could make a third prediction. At some level, most of you are frustrated because all of this stuff you're doing isn't producing the fruit that you want it to. Maybe it's producing some fruit. Maybe you're fortunate to be part of a growing church, and that's awesome that God is doing that through your church. But my guess is, even if you have a growing church, somewhere in the back of your mind, there is this fear. If we stop, if we slow down, if we don't do any, like if we stop doing any of these things we're doing, that our growth will also stop. And so there's sort of just this relentless pace of doing and doing and doing. And so these 2 historical realities are actually why we created Multiply Project, because we have a goal of really accomplishing a couple of things. One is our mission is to sort of move the epicenter of leadership development back into the local church. That doesn't mean that colleges and seminaries don't have a role to play, but we believe that it's the church's primary responsibility to develop leaders. And secondly, we believe that healthy churches grow and multiply. Somebody says here, leadership. I love that. I'm so glad that you experienced it, and I don't know where you are, Dr. Jones, but actually in my own life, I did as well. I happened to be part of a student ministry that on the outside in the late 70s and early 80s looked like every other student ministry with all the crazy activities and youth group games and stuff that they did. But actually, our youth pastor spent most of his time discipling students like myself. And I learned how to make disciples before I ever graduated from high school, because that's what I was being trained to do, and learned what my spiritual gifts were. And that's why I'm in ministry today, is because I was taught all of those things in the context of a local church, which was amazing and powerful for me. Church multiplication requires us to see our church as an organism that multiplies instead of an organization that grows, right? All living things grow and multiply. The church is a body. We know Paul says that. Jesus talks about the vine and the branches. All we're trying to do is really restore a biblical perspective about the church. But the question is, how do you make that shift? Now, the first thing I'm going to assume is you're here. And because you're here, at least some level, you want to be a multiplying church. And you're willing to start doing some things that produce multiplication. And it really is a different operating system. I am probably the only person on this call that does not own an iPhone. This is actually a Google Pixel phone. And yes, you can all laugh at me for not owning an iPhone, okay? But we won't argue about which phone is better. But imagine if you've got your iPhone somewhere near you and you and I trade phones. I give you my Google Pixel phone. You give me your Apple iPhone. What is going to happen to both of us? We are both going to be confused. Jacob has a Pixel. I am so proud of you, Jacob. You and I can be friends, right? We're both going to be confused, right? We can argue about which one is better, but at a certain level, it doesn't matter, because that level of change of different operating systems is just going to cause both of us confused. I won't know how to make a phone call. I won't know how to read an email or send a text. All of those things will be confusing, but you know what? That's how we often approach change in the church. Have you ever thought about that? Like we get some idea, like, oh, we need this new thing. And then what do? We go and we change everything in the church all at once. And what happens? People are confused. They don't know what to do. We don't know what, like, people get unhappy. They leave. So I want to tell you right off the top, I am not going to ask you over the next 3 workshops today and the next couple months to change everything in your church. Not even close. I'm actually going to ask you to think about making 3 changes, 3 shifts that I believe will move your church from a growth trajectory to a multiplication trajectory. And those 3 shifts are this. We're going to challenge you to shift from what? From focusing on what do we do, what do we do, what do we do next, to focusing on who. Who's next instead of what's next. From delegating, from focusing on getting people to volunteer and to do things, to developing. How can we actually develop, invest, invite people to grow and develop into multipliers in our church? And thirdly, to shift the focus from members, how do we get more people to come in, to actually, how do we produce missionaries that we are sending out into our community, into our state, into our world, whose focus is to make disciples? Those are the 3 shifts that we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about those one at a time. So today, from what to who, the second workshop, delegating to developing, and the third one, from members to missionaries. And I'm going to pause there, Ephraim, and say, any questions? I don't know. I haven't seen any questions in the thing. Any questions anybody has? Just that foundation of multiplication is so important to what we're going to talk about. All right. So let's jump into, how do we do this? How do we make this first shift? So a multiplying church asks, who's next, then what's next? All right, do need to use the chat for this. Here's a question for you. It's August 28th. How many of you have already planned your Christmas season for your church? Just type yes or no in the chat. How many of you planned your Christmas season for your church? No. Oh, I'm actually going to like this group of people. Has anybody planned their Christmas? Oh, there's one. Yes. Yes. Okay. There's a few. No. Yes. Okay. Some of it. Yeah. And I'm not talking like, every song you're going to sing every Sunday. But if we looked at the calendar, we would know the things we're doing. Yeah. Somebody's just starting to talk about it, right? why am I asking that? Because it's an illustration of how we think about what we do in our churches first, right? Christmas is months away, but we're thinking about what are we going to do? Let me ask you this. How many of you have a wall at your church that looks like this? And maybe it's not a wall, maybe it's, online, whatever. Some of you, I can see whiteboards. Maybe some of you in this call, we can actually see that wall from where you're sitting, right? How many of you have a wall that looks like that at your church? The calendar of weeks and months of what we're going to do. Well, these people are great. I don't know if I should say that you don't plan or that you're actually already focused on multiplication. Tim's honest, like he's got a calendar like that somewhere. It's probably on the side of his wall that we can't see from here. But here's then a third question. And by the way, I'm not want to tell you that you should stop planning. The statement here is that you ask who's next first. Who's next, then what next? Let me ask you this. Does your church have more plans than people? What do you think? Does your church have more plans than people? Right? You have more ideas, more things that you want to do than you have people to actually do them. Now, again, I'm not trying to make you feel guilty, but all of those things are what happens when we sort of have this what first view of church. And so we want to shift that from what to who. A multiplying church asks who's next, then what's next. Why? Well, the first thing that shifts when we do this is we realize that people increase capacity, programs consume capacity. Everything you add to the calendar in your church, it consumes capacity. Every person you develop, it adds capacity. People multiply, right? People can actually multiply. People can make disciples who make disciples. Even if you have a program that makes disciples, that program doesn't multiply, right? And then there's this simple reality that the Holy Spirit is alive in your people, not in your programs. Jesus never said that the Holy Spirit lived in your programs. He said the Holy Spirit would live and dwell in your people. And so God's kingdom grows through spiritual generations, just like the world grows through biological generations. How did we get from Adam and Eve to 8 billion people? Well, it's pretty simple, right? People kept having babies who have babies who have babies have babies, and there's 8 billion people. I don't know if you've ever looked at your family tree. I have an aunt who wrote a whole book about at least my dad's side of the family, all the way back to, people come to the US. It's crazy. And it's really cool. But have you ever researched your spiritual family tree? Just be curious if you've ever done that. This is interesting for me. That aunt who wrote that book is one of the people that's part of my spiritual family tree. Ironically, it's because she liked a boy who was a Christian. And that boy invited her to go to church. And she said yes because she liked him, and she became a follower of Jesus. My dad was her younger brother, and she took my dad to church, and my dad became a Christian because of a boy that she didn't even end up marrying, who was a follower of Jesus. My mother grew up homeless during the Depression. She and her younger sister, they were only like 10 and 12 years old, were actually living alone in a migrant farm worker camp. I can't even imagine. Her mother had died, her dad was an alcoholic, and a Christian couple came to the camp and they saw my mom and her sister and said, "We've got to get you out of here." Now, this is before the days of foster care. Today, with people accused of kidnapping, I get all that stuff. But this was a Christian couple who took my mom and her sister home, and they gave them a place to sleep and food to eat and got them in school, but also introduced them to Jesus. Now, I don't know the names of that guy. I don't know the names of that couple. I don't know what churches they were a part of. All this happened more than 90 years ago. But it's because of those people that I can't even name that I am a follower of Jesus today, and I am a person who makes disciples. That's how spiritual generations work, and that's how God's kingdom grows, is because disciples make disciples. So changing the question changes the outcome. God's kingdom grows through spiritual generations, just like the world grows through biological generations. And so what does this shift look like? Asking who's next leads to multiplication. So who are you looking for? If we're asking a who's next question, who are you looking for? You need a scouting guide. Now, you already told me from it's a football place. I couldn't find a Texas scouting guide. I'm sorry. Like you guys live in football country. So every high school football coach in your community has a scouting guide. I promise. He's got a list with names on it. And he's got, skills, whatever. And every college team does, and every pro team does. They have a scouting guide. They know who you're looking for. Now, I want to say this as we go into this. Every person in your church is of equal value to God. This kid, Eric Fisher, he is of value to God, not because he got a grade 94 or he's a great offensive tackle or he plays for the Kansas City Chiefs. He's valuable to God because God created him. It's true of every person in your church and every person in your community. But I guarantee that Eric can contribute more to the Kansas City Chiefs goal of winning football games than I can, right? By leaps and bounds. And so what we realize is people are of equal value, but people don't all have the same contribution to make. Jesus in the parable of talents talked about, gave away bags of gold in this parable, 5 and 2 and 1. Why? People didn't have the same competency and capacity. And so this scouting guide is designed to help you identify the good soil, those who have the greatest missional potential in your church. And so here's what you're looking for. You're looking for people of character who are called, competent, and capable. Character is pretty obvious, pretty straightforward. You're looking for people being transformed by the work of the Holy Spirit in their lives. Can you see visible fruit, right? Paul talked about the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. Can you see that being formed in them? If so, then it's okay. This is a person whose character is being formed by Jesus. What about calling? I think that there are 3 things that help people really understand their calling, right? You're looking for people who are convinced God has called them to a people. Do you have people in your church who just feel called to work with children? Maybe people in your church who feel called to work with students, maybe with elderly people. Maybe they feel called to work with the people in their job and their workplace. Maybe there's a particular group of people in the community. But when people have a sense that those are the people that are my responsibility, that's an indication of their calling. The second thing is that they're called for a purpose. They have something that they believe God wants them to accomplish. I'm into church planting, so I think God calls some people for the purpose of planting churches amongst a group of people. But maybe that's not always the purpose. Maybe it's a teaching purpose. Maybe it's a serving purpose. But they would be clear, hey, God's called me to these people for this purpose. And finally, they would have a part to play. Like they would know this is the part. And again, some people are leaders. Somebody said, God's called me to be a church planter, to lead in that way. Other people might say, you know what, I'm a servant. Like God, I serve behind the scenes. That's okay. Calling, when someone knows these 3 things and can describe them, these are the people I'm called to. This is the purpose that I have in being with them. And this is the part that I have to play. Then that's a clear calling. I have a friend who is called to unhoused population. And actually his purpose is to make disciples. And he planted a church in a homeless camp because that was where he felt called, right? And I didn't convince him of that. God convinced him of that. And that's another thing that's really important. How many of you ever resorted to convincing someone in your church to do something by saying, I really need your help with this? Now, that's okay. I will admit I've done that as well. But here's the problem with that personal relational motivation is today they will say yes to you, but tomorrow someone else will say what? I really need you to do this. And guess what? Their motivation shifts from what you asked them to do to what that person asked them to do. Probably better than I need you to do this is identifying what the need is. There are, maybe it's, we need workers in children's ministry. The children in our church have a need. Students in our church have a need. Someone in our community has. And so we sort of use the need as the motivator. But the problem with that, again, is even that eventually some other group of people will come along with a need that seems greater. And then what happens? Their motivation shifts. Calling is a higher motivation than both of those things because it doesn't come from people. It doesn't come from circumstances. It comes from God. And if I am called, right, if that's how I perceive that, then relationally, that's from God. No one is higher in my relationships than with God. And it's not even so much about the need. It's really almost about an obedience. Like God told me to do this. And so I have to do it until God tells me to do something else. And so calling, needs are effective in recruiting short-term volunteers. And if you have something you need done this Sunday, tell people what's needed, tell people you need it, you'll get them to show up on Sunday and do it. I'm not saying you should never do that. But that motivation doesn't call people to be multipliers. If you want people to be multipliers, they need to have a sense of calling that comes from God, that this is the thing that God is asking them to do. And so how do you help them clarify that? And how do you find the people in your church that maybe already have that sense of calling? The third thing is competence. Big word, probably more used in the marketplace, but it's a big bucket that holds 3 ideas for me. The first of these is spiritual gifts. And in my experience, spent a lot of time in church Most people, even those who've been in church for a long time, don't have any idea what their spiritual gifts were. I love, Dr. Jones, you said a little bit ago that was in your church that someone showed you what your spiritual gifts were. I love that. Like, how do we make sure that people know those gifts and know how to use them and know when they are using them? Talents is different. I put an artist on here. That's how I think of talent, like things that people are just good at. Sometimes think about that with music, people who are musical. I've never taken art classes because I know I'm not autistic. I have taken music lessons. I still can't play an instrument because I don't have any artistical musical talent, but God gave me other talents things I just seem to be good at. And then of course there are skills. Skills are things that anybody can be taught. Almost anybody can be taught. We learn them by doing them by practice. And so competency is just this big word. And as you look at people in your church, who are those who are competent and what are their competencies? What are their gifts, their talents, their skills? And then finally, capacity. Are they living out healthy habits spiritually? Are they in the Word? Do they pray regularly? Do they fast? Mentally and emotionally. Typically, this is about just good relationships where they manage stress and emotions. Maybe some of us actually go to a counselor, make sure that we stay mentally and emotionally healthy. Relationally, this is mostly about peacemaking. Everyone has conflict, but do people pursue peace in their relationships so they're not in a constant state of conflict? Physically, diet, exercise, obvious things. Financially, do we spend less than we earn and give away more than we have to? Now, why do we talk about capacity here? Because you may have people in your church, and my guess is some of you have experienced this, who have a sense of calling, who have a high level of competence, but a low level of capacity, meaning they don't have these healthy habits in their lives. And what happens is all the calling and competence that God has given them gets derailed by these poor habits, by poor spiritual health, by poor mental emotional health, by poor relational health, or financial health, or physical health. And so instead of realizing the potential that God's created in them, they're always distracted into these areas where they are not healthy. And so we want to find people who have capacity. So we have these things. You're looking for people of character who are called, who are competent, and who are capable. How do you do that? There's a link here again, and if you go to this folder, you're going to find two versions of this worksheet. There is a Google version that you'll have to make a copy of and save to your Google Drive. If you're a Google person like me, there's an Excel version that you can just download and save on your computer. And I want to just show you quickly what we're asking you to do here in just a very simple creating of a scouting report for your church. Obviously, put people's names in. I just made up some names and put in here Carlos. So I put Carlos on here, someone in my church that I have observed that Carlos is a person of high character. I've heard, and this is significant, they're both green, but sort of a different level. I haven't talked to Carlos about his calling, but someone said something that made me think that Carlos has a sense of calling. I don't know about his competencies. That's something I'm unsure about. So I need to investigate that. And I know that there are some unhealthy habits in Carlos' life that hinder his capacity. Now, let me say something about the green, yellow, red, because I know that there are some of you who will look at this and say, how can you mark someone red on a scouting report? Doesn't Jesus tell us not to judge others? Here's the reality. Judging has the purpose or the objective of condemning and putting others down, right? That's judgment. Like you have this fault, this failure, and so you're being judged, you're being put down. This is a developmental exercise, and development is the exact opposite of judgment. Development is a lifting up, a building up, which is something we were told to do, build one another. All you're doing is identifying a place where someone needs to be built up. So don't be afraid to put red things in here. It's just saying, hey, this is where a person needs to grow. And so you could go through and do this and just mark these about people in your church. Now, here's the idea, and here's really the challenge for you. To download this report, this is a one-time activity. As long as you adopt the rhythms I'm going to talk about in a minute, and fill in this scouting report, thinking about people in your church. If you're solo, what I mean by that is you're the pastor of a church and you don't have any staff, you might want to just sit down by yourself and just work through this. Just give yourself an hour or two. I like to go sit and have a really good cup of coffee someplace where I can focus. I won't be interrupted. And I just want you to think about, and I would actually recommend this. Find a list of all the people in your church somewhere and just go down the list. Don't try and remember them. Just go down the list and say, think to yourself, have I seen their character? Have I seen their calling? Have I seen their competency? I've seen their capacity. If you look at the template that I've given you to download, there's actually a second page that breaks all 4 of those areas into their smaller elements of people and role, or of gifts and talents. And you could use the more detailed version if you like. If you have a small team, I see some teams that are on here. Maybe this is something you want to do together. Maybe you schedule a meeting for a couple hours and you just go through together, because some of you are going to know things about people that others don't. And maybe it's valuable to work on this activity together. If you're in a larger church, this is the reality. I've worked in larger churches, and sort of the reality of it is no one person knows everybody. And so then you have to think about, how do you do this as sort of within departments or teams? And so you focus on the people that are part of, that that are within your context of ministry in your church. If you have a larger church and you do that in the context, here's a recommendation. And that recommendation is that you bring all those lists together, because I know what happens. There's going to be 2 or 3 people that are on everybody's list. And so you want to have a master list that sort of eliminates those duplicates. The other thing that you want to make sure that you do, if you're not doing this activity just on your own, is you want to add a column. There's a space there where you can just add a column, and you want to put a name in there of the person who has primary relationship with the person on the scouting guide. And you're going to see why in a minute. That's the person that's going to pray and invest in them. And so you want to know where that accountability is. So this is, I don't know if I told you there'd be homework, but there's homework, and this is your homework. Just an hour or two to create a scouting guide, a list of people in your church that could be developed as multipliers. Again, this is the shift from what to who. Some of you will ask, how many people? That's a common question when I talk about this. People say, well, how many? Like, what if I end up with the name of everybody in my church on the list? Or what if I only end up with 2 or 3 people's names? Here's just some guidelines, and they're just guidelines. If you have less than 10%, whatever the size of your church is, if you have less than 10%, you probably don't have enough names. You're probably missing some people who have missional potential, some people who are actually good soil that should be added on the list. So if you have a church of 100 people and you only have 4 names, go through the list again and think, hey, who else in my church maybe has missional potential that I'm missing? And by the way, if you find someone in your church who is like the observed, like right, they're already a person of character, called, competent, of high capacity. The question is, why aren't they already, why haven't they already been developed to lead and to multiply, right? That would be, I would guess they're already in that role. If you find someone that you are confident that just one of these elements exists, put their name on the list and just keep watching. If there's someone, when you think of them, you can think of 2 things. Like, well, I know they have character, and I know they have some gifts and skills, some competency. Put their name on the list. And maybe do a little bit of investigation. Maybe you've never asked them about a sense of calling. Maybe you've never asked them about their healthy habits. And so that would become a next step that you could do. If someone's got 3 of these things, it's probably time to have an I see in you conversation. And we're going to talk about all of these conversations in the next session. How do we talk to them and say, hey, maybe God has a purpose, a calling for you, and how could I come alongside you and help you move towards that? And obviously, if someone is all 4 of them, we want to get them involved in multiplying right away. On the flip side, I would say if you end up with more than a third of your church on your list, so again, you got a church of 100, it's 33 people, a church of 1,000, it's 333 people, your list is probably too long. And the danger of that is back to the parable of the soils, because remember the seed that went into soil that was thorny or that was rocky and it didn't produce any fruit. And so what happens when you begin to invest in poor soil is that your effort doesn't produce fruit. And so you want to be selective enough to identify good soil, but not so selective that you're missing out on the opportunity to develop people's missional potential. So that's the key thing that we want to ask you to do is, and again, this is just that shift from what to who. Is there a list somewhere of people who have missional potential in your church? And by the way, I've talked to so many churches, even churches that we would think of these huge mega churches that do all of these great things, but their focus is so on what. Nobody has any of these lists anywhere. They're not thinking about who. And so this is the critical shift from what to who. But then there are 3 rhythms that we want to challenge you to adopt that are part of this, that will help you make this shift. And these are pretty significant, even though they're not very difficult. The first is just daily prayer. Once you create that list, just a simple thing. Pray for one person on that list every day. You might be tempted, if you're a prayer person, pray for every person on the list. If you can do that, that's great. But you might have a long list. That's going to be difficult to maintain over time, but you can take time to pray for one person on the list every day. First person on the list, second person on the list, just when you get to the bottom, go back to the top, pray for one person every day. Just develop that rhythm in your life that shifts your focus from what to who. The second rhythm is weekly influence. At least once a week, invest in someone whose name is on that list. Now, again, we've already talked about some different things. Maybe you just have a conversation. It could be a phone conversation, just getting better acquainted with them. Maybe you get together with them over coffee or lunch, have an I see in you conversation. Maybe you're actually developing them and it becomes a coaching conversation. We'll talk about the differences in all of those conversations in the next session of how you begin to develop people into multipliers. And then the third rhythm is simply to update the list once a month, just to bring your focus back. So at least once a month, just like you're asking, what are we going to do next month? You're asking the question, who are we going to be investing in as a church? Who are we developing into multipliers? And so those are the three simple rhythms. One activity, develop a scouting guide, three rhythms, daily prayer, weekly influence, monthly update that will shift your focus from what to who. And it may seem at this point like, well, how's that going to lead to multiplication? And there are other things that are needed to get all the way to multiplication, but this is the shift that changes the trajectory, that begins to put your church on a different path as your priority becomes who over what. All right, I'll stop there. Efren, questions, comments, challenges, issues, problems.
I did have a comment about the calling and the need. That is a very good snapshot, because you feel like you see the need and you feel like there's a person that will meet that need or maybe call for that need. But I have experienced that when you ask and then somebody else asks, they'll immediately go without fulfilling the need or the calling, and something else will come up and then they'll hop to that. So that discernment was good when you said that, got to make sure that there's a calling there for that person. And I also thought about what Dr. Jones, I think, said. She put in there, I took the spiritual gifts test as well. And sometimes it pans out to it did pan out to who I was, but I was across the spectrum, if I could say that. And so there were multiple gifts that were there. But now we don't really do those spiritual gifts or tests anymore, or surveys anymore, what they were called. So now I think what I'm hearing is that we are really relying on that discernment, having a relationship with the congregants, and definitely praying about what that calling is and the competence and the capacity. So I really enjoyed that piece. I did learn quite a bit from there. So thank you for sharing.
I'll give you a little sneak peek of the next workshop. Okay, so this is part of the next one, but since you're talking about the gifts, just a simple question that you can ask people that I find sort of causes people to sometimes stop in their tracks, but is good for them to think about, is to ask them the question, what are you most likely to be doing when you have the sense that God is working through you? Because a lot of times people end up confusing spiritual gifts with natural talents or skills, right? There's things that they're just good at. Like there's some administrative kinds of things that I'm good at. I am convinced that if I didn't know who Jesus was and didn't follow him, didn't have any Holy Spirit, I'd still be good at those things. Now, they came from God, right? But the things that came from God at my first birth, not at my second birth, right? And so spiritual gifts are what I got at the second birth because I have the Holy Spirit in me, and they're things that when they're operating, they're operating because the Holy Spirit is operating through me. Asking that question, I find, sometimes causes people to step back and sort of eliminates the talents and skills, right? The things that they're good at in other environments, which we're not saying can't be used for the kingdom. They absolutely can. It's just the clarity of, well, my spiritual gift is this, because when I do that, I have the sense that God is actually working through me to do something I don't know that I could do on my own. That's a spiritual gift.
Okay. And can you repeat that question just one time? I was writing it down and listening.
What are you most likely to be doing when you have the sense that God is working through you?
Okay. Thank you.
Simple question. And great conversation with people that might lead to some ahas about their spiritual gifts.
As you are taking this information in and processing, just initially, what do you think might be some challenges to moving into this first shift from what to who in your own context there? As you are, have processed and have heard this first shift from what to who in your own context, what do you think can be a challenge or can be an obstacle for you to move into this direction? And I'm glad that Craig laid out 3 simple steps, right? It was just 3 simple steps in this first one. But can you think of anything that might be holding you guys back from going from what to who?
Time.
So I'll give you another freebie on time. Absolutely. You are all incredibly busy. Like the fact that you're here. So this is a coaching thing that I do with people. Anytime you find something that you think is a high value activity, so that's the first decision you have to make. If I just presented you with a high value activity, if not, then you probably shouldn't even do it. But if it is a high value activity, then what you need to do is find 2 lower value activities that you're going to stop doing. The something about our American mindset is we just add things to do until we're so overwhelmed that we can't do any of them, right? And so it's real. I'm not trying, but if this is a high value activity, what are 2 lower value, not low value, lower value things that you will stop doing in order to make time for this new higher value activity? Now, there's 2 ways to do that. If the lower value thing is still important, you do delegate it. You ask somebody else to do it. Maybe it's not important at all as you delete it. Here's the danger. This is what we normally do as busy Americans. We defer it. You say, oh, this is great. I'll do this. Then I'll do that other thing that I didn't, right? And now we're overwhelmed, we're busy. And so I would challenge you to have the honest thought with yourself. What are 2 things that you would say, you know what? This is more important than these 2 things I'm doing. I'm going to stop doing those 2 things so that I can do this one thing. And honestly, yes, it's going to take time. I don't want to say it isn't, but again, we're trying to give you simple things. A couple hours to create your scouting report, an hour a week to have a conversation with someone, an hour a month to update your list. I'm asking for, maybe 6 hours of your month max, not even 6 hours a week. And so it's the kind of thing that if it's a priority, it's doable. But it probably will still mean that there's some things you need to say no to.
Yes, sir. I agree on that. I was thinking more because I'm all in. I really, my heart is just is on fire listening to you. I'm just thinking in terms of like I already have my eye on people, and so I'm thinking from their perspective, because most people are not in vocational ministry, even bivocational ministry, but when it comes to developing leaders and multipliers, I was just thinking in terms of their schedule, and so it is just going to take time to kind of see this, see the fruit from it, I guess.
Yep. This is you've all heard the things, turn a ship 1 degree and where does it end up 100 miles later, right? This is that kind of a shift. It's just this little shift from what to who that next week won't seem any different. Next month might not seem any different, but next year you'll start to realize you're in a different place. And 5 years from now, you realize, holy cow, how did we get here? This is an entirely different place than where we were headed if we hadn't made this shift. And so that's part of why the rhythms is the shift has to be maintained over time, because this is the other thing that I know, that what is powerful, and the what will constantly try to pull you back to the old way. It's like this rubber band that just yanks you back to the old way of doing things. And so it takes a lot of discipline. Just say, nope, adopt these 3 rhythms. I'm going to do them, and we're going to see where they lead over time. And I love that you already have your eye on people, Ray. I get myself in trouble because if I come and visit your church, I'm going to have lunch with you afterwards and tell you, did you know these 2 people in your church could be church planners? You're going to look at me like I'm crazy.
I really like the 3 points that you identified, Craig. The prayer, and you said that one first. The weekly influence, that's that touching base relationship building. Yep. And then the monthly. And that does take time. We got to, as you said, we can't be thinking about what if we haven't identified the who.
Yep. And again, the idea would be that over time, those three things just become new habits, right? That if you're not doing them, then you have to think consciously about doing them right now. But again, the idea that 6 months from now, a year from now, you realize, oh, we just do these things every week, every month, every day, just because it's just become what we do. And that's the point at which you're, again, sort of that trajectory has shifted in a different direction. And you'll begin to see all kinds of fruit that comes from just, even if you did nothing else but these three things.
So I have a quick question too before we end. If you know that that person that is not their calling, and you've done the three steps, you've invested the prayer, you've invested the influence, and you've gone through that process, and you see that that person that you have been guiding or grooming or walking with for that position. I guess my question would be, how do you back up when you see that that's maybe not the right course or direction for that person, and still maintain the relationship? And I know prayer is the number one thing in conversation, but if anybody has experienced that,
Oh,
just
yeah.
as we planned. I mean, I know
I have. Okay.
absolutely.
Let me say, none of this is about the value of a person, right? So none of this changes the value of anyone. They're valuable because God created them. That's it. That's all. So it doesn't change that. And just remembering that is helpful. There are really two reasons sort of how we end up in what you're describing. And the first one is a little bit harder to acknowledge. Maybe we've been investing in bad soil. Right. And like, that's harsh. And I know, like, back to the judgment, but I have invested in bad soil. Like I I know how painful that is. And so sometimes maybe we just need to acknowledge that. And then that's where we come back to prayer, because the only thing that's going to change that is God. There's nothing we're going to do to change that. The second thing, though, that I found sometimes has been true is that I have a calling for them that's not God's calling for them.
Mhm.
Right. And so I've been trying to develop someone towards a role or towards some activity, towards something that's because I see it in them. They don't see it in themselves. And even worse, God doesn't see it in them. And so then I'm the one who kind of has to back up and repent and say, okay, this has been my agenda. God, what's your agenda? You need to make a calling clear to this person, so they have that sense of calling, will pursue that. Otherwise, it's sort of and I would say this is the calling. Without calling, I'm pushing rope, right? You all know this metaphor, right? I'm just pushing rope. With calling, God is pulling them towards some role, some engagement, something that God desires them to do. And that pull is infinitely more powerful than my push.
Well, guys, thank you so much. I truly appreciate your time here with us, and a lot of great content. Grateful for Craig and putting this together. And I know for some of us too, it's something to begin processing, right? It's a change of thinking when it comes to multiplication and kingdom advancement. It's a shift in how we do and operate in the church, right? From what to who. And so as you begin to just make some small changes in beginning to identify who are these other people that we can develop, I know that it will be a tremendous blessing. Craig, did you have anything else before we close our time?
I just thank you for being here, for participating, and I just want to encourage you to just take the small steps, but believe in the power of the small step. And this could seem, whatever you got going on in church, this could seem overwhelming, and like this just doesn't seem like it's going to change that thing over there. But just want to encourage you to believe in the power of the small step and how God could use this to really change the trajectory of your church.
Yeah, and to add to that, it is very important for us to identify within our churches those people that God has sent us. And I know for a fact that God has sent every single one of our churches individuals that He wants us to identify, engage with, and begin the process of seeing what the Lord has for them. Maybe that next church planter is in your congregation. We know that to be true. We know that there's a future leader in your congregation, and we know that to be true. And so for us, we're called to identify them and equip them. So my prayer is that as we continue to make disciples who make disciples, and that we would begin to shift our focus on this here, from what to who. And I'm excited about the next one. And so I hope you guys have that on your calendar. It is workshop number 2, from delegating to developing. That is on Thursday, September 26th at noon. And so we've sent out an email with the Zoom link for that. And so if you haven't received the Zoom link with session 2, please let us know. But we will send a reminder to everybody to make sure that you are receiving the information. Again, thank you so much. Grateful for you all. Thank you, Craig. And come on, let's give it up for Craig. And in this first session here, everybody's muted, but I see the claps, and I know that you're making a joyful noise to the Lord.